The night was quiet. There was a chill in the air and the streets were empty. The sounds of distant traffic were muffled and the only light came from street lamps casting a yellowish glow across the pavement. For most people, it was just another night. But for him, it was different. He had just finished a long day, and now, after work, he was walking down the street toward his apartment, just a few blocks away. His mind was preoccupied with the events of the day, meetings, phone calls, and the constant demands of his job. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. As the leader of the police union, he had to be on top of everything. He often found himself having difficult conversations with fellow officers, and even higher-ups about policies, treatment, and fairness. It wasn't an easy role to take on, but he had always felt a strong sense of duty to serve his community. He understood the system better than most, and he knew the struggles that both officers and citizens faced in their everyday lives. But on this particular evening, he wasn't thinking about work. He was simply trying to unwind and get home. The weight of the day had begun to take its toll, and he was looking forward to relaxing for a bit. As he walked, he passed familiar buildings, old shops, restaurants, and homes that had stood for years. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was his. He'd lived here for a long time and knew the people around him. It felt safe, even though it wasn't always. As he turned a corner onto a quieter street, something caught his eye. In the distance, he saw flashing lights, a police car's siren flickering in the dark. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police patrols were common in the area, especially during the late hours. He didn't expect that they would pay him any attention. After all, he was just a man walking home. But as he kept walking, the lights seemed to get closer, and a sense of unease began to settle in. He continued walking, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, and then, out of nowhere, he heard the sound of running footsteps behind him. Before he could fully turn around, he was grabbed from behind. His body hit the ground hard, the force of the push leaving him momentarily stunned. He didn't even have time to react. The world seemed to spin for a moment. He tried to breathe, but his chest was tight. Hands were pulling at him, pushing him down. His heart raced. What was happening? He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had no idea why this was happening to him. "Get on the ground!" A voice shouted from above. The command was sharp, and before he could even make sense of it, his face was pressed into the cold concrete. He struggled to move, but the weight of the officers on him kept him pinned. His mind raced, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. He was just walking home. Why were they doing this? "Stay still! Don't move," the voice commanded again. Everything around him felt wrong. He had dealt with police officers before, but never like this. Never so aggressive, never so quick to use force. His thoughts raced as he struggled to stay calm. What had caused them to act this way? What had he done to deserve this? He hadn't even spoken to anyone, let alone committed a crime. The officers continued shouting at him, and for a moment he thought about yelling back. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His heart was pounding, and his mind was filled with confusion. The weight of the situation seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. What could he do to make them stop? Then, through the chaos, a voice suddenly spoke. "Hold up. That's him. Stop." The officers froze for a moment, and one by one they looked up at the officer who had spoken. He sounded urgent, almost surprised. The man on the ground didn't understand. What did they mean by "that's him"? What was going on? Who were they referring to? The officer who had shouted at the others stepped forward, kneeling next to him. He looked down at the man, his expression shifting from stern to something closer to confusion. Are you really him?" the officer asked, almost in disbelief. The man was still too stunned to respond. His thoughts were all over the place, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He could barely catch his breath. The officer's voice, once commanding, now seemed almost apologetic. After a moment of hesitation, the officer gently helped him to his feet, keeping his hands on the man's arms to steady him. "Sorry about that," he said, his tone softer now. "We got a tip about someone matching your description. Thought you were someone else." The man still couldn't understand. He was just a guy walking home. He had no idea who they were talking about. What description? What tip? It didn't make sense. But the officer's eyes were full of recognition now, as if he was seeing the man for the first time. "You're the union leader, right?" the officer asked quietly. The words took a moment to process. The man was still trying to make sense of the situation. But when the officer mentioned the union, a slow realization hit him. Of course, they must have recognized him as the leader of the police union, but even so, it didn't explain why they had knocked him down like that. Why had it taken this much force? Why hadn't they recognized him earlier? The officer, now visibly embarrassed, stepped back, shaking his head. "Sorry, we didn't know it was you. We were just following orders." But this went way too far. The man could hardly believe what he was hearing. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or angry. The situation still felt wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to go down. "I've had enough of these kinds of situations," the officer continued, his voice now tinged with guilt. "I should have recognized you. We should have been more careful." The man stood there for a moment, still trying to process everything. The officers around him seemed to be waiting for him to say something, but he didn't know what to say. He was still trying to figure out how things had gotten so out of control. He had been treated like a criminal, and all because of a simple mistake. But this wasn't just any mistake. This was a mistake made by people who should have known better. As the officer continued to apologize, the man simply nodded, his mind racing with thoughts about the larger issues at play here. How many times had this happened before? How many people had been treated this way simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time? It wasn't just a mistake, it was a symptom of a much larger problem. And he knew that if nothing changed, incidents like this would keep happening. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and as the man made his way home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. The silence that followed the officer's apology hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The man, still shaken from what had just happened, remained still, his mind spinning with a mixture of confusion, frustration, and disbelief. He had never experienced anything like this before. Yes, he had encountered challenges in his career, difficult conversations with officers, disagreements with higher-ups. But this was something else entirely. He had been thrown to the ground without warning, treated as though he was a criminal, and for what? Because of a mistake? A simple mistake that had escalated into something far more serious. As he walked the final steps toward his apartment, the weight of the moment seemed to grow heavier. The air felt colder, and the streetlights that had once seemed familiar now appeared distant and unwelcoming. He tried to push the incident out of his mind to focus on the routine of getting home, but it was impossible. The forceful actions of the officers, the shock in their voices when they realized who he was, it all replayed in his mind like a loop. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here, something that had nothing to do with the officers or even the misunderstanding. The truth was, he had spent years in his position as the leader of the police union, fighting for fairness, justice, and accountability within the department. But despite all his efforts, the issues he had been trying to address, issues like bias, inequality, and a lack of communication, seemed to only get worse. He had seen how easily some officers could slip into the mindset of us versus them, where civilians were seen as suspects and nothing more. But this was different. The way he had been treated, the aggression, the lack of recognition, it was a wake-up call. It was a reminder that no matter how much he had done for the department, he was still vulnerable, still subject to the same biases as anyone else. When he finally reached his apartment, he barely registered the elevator ride up or the soft click of the door closing behind him. All he could think about was the question that kept nagging at him. Why had this happened? He knew that he wasn't an outsider in his own department, but it felt like he had just been treated like one. Was it because of the color of his skin? Was it because he was seen as different because of his position? Or was it just an unfortunate mistake? The question swirled in his mind, unanswered and unsettling. He sat down on his couch, his jacket still on, his mind racing. He had been on the receiving end of criticism before, both from the public and from his fellow officers, but this felt different. This felt personal. He had always known that there were deep-rooted problems within the police force, but he had never fully understood how deep those problems went until now. It wasn't just about policies and procedures. It wasn't just about training or leadership. It was about the way people viewed each other, the assumptions they made based on appearances, the way certain individuals were treated differently because of who they were or what they represented. As he sat there alone in his apartment, he couldn't help but replay the officer's words in his head. "We thought you were someone else." The officer had said it with such sincerity, such regret, that it almost felt like an apology for something far greater than just a misunderstanding. It felt like an apology for the larger issues that had plagued the department for years. And yet that apology didn't change what had happened. It didn't change the way he had been treated, the way he had been thrown to the ground and handled with such force. No, an apology wasn't enough. Not this time. In the days that followed, the man found himself reflecting on what had happened more and more. He knew that he couldn't let this incident go without taking some kind of action. He had seen enough to know that things needed to change, that the system needed to be held accountable. But where would he start? He was the leader of the police union, but even he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed support, he needed allies, and most importantly, he needed people to listen. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about the personal affront he had experienced. It was about the bigger picture, the problems within the department, the bias, the lack of accountability, the way officers had been trained to view people in certain neighborhoods or from certain backgrounds as the enemy, the way the system seemed to treat everyone the same, civilians, officers, or leaders, based solely on assumptions, not on facts or individual character. The next morning, he arrived at the office early. He had a meeting scheduled with several senior officers to discuss the department's ongoing initiatives, but today, the conversation would be different. Today, he would bring up what had happened. Today, he would ask the tough questions. He walked into the meeting room where a few officers were already seated. They looked up at him as he entered, and for a moment the room was silent. He could feel the weight of the previous night still hanging over him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. As the meeting began, the officers dove into the usual topics: training programs, community outreach efforts, and the state of the department's internal investigations. But the man had other things on his mind. He listened for a moment, then cleared his throat. "I need to address something," he said, his voice steady but firm. The officers paused, exchanging uncertain glances. They weren't sure what was coming, but they knew from his tone that this wouldn't be another routine conversation. "Last night," the man continued, "I was treated like a criminal by a group of officers. I was thrown to the ground, restrained, and it wasn't until they realized who I was that they stopped." The room went completely still. Every officer in the room was now looking at him with a mix of surprise, discomfort, and guilt. "I understand that mistakes happen," he went on, "but this was no accident. This was a failure in recognizing someone within our own department. It was a failure to treat people with respect, regardless of who they are or what role they play." The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of them looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others seemed to be processing what he had just said, trying to make sense of it. One of the senior officers cleared his throat. "We take full responsibility for what happened," he said, his voice cautious. "But we need to understand the bigger picture here. You're right. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about the way we view each other, the way we treat people based on assumptions, not facts. And that's something we need to fix." The man nodded, feeling a sense of relief that at least someone was acknowledging the deeper issues at play. But he knew that words weren't enough. Actions were what mattered. He couldn't let this go, not after everything he had seen, everything he had fought for over the years. "I'm asking for more than just an apology," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm asking for change. Real change. We need to address the bias, the systemic issues, the way we train our officers to view civilians, especially those who come from different backgrounds. This isn't just about one mistake. This is about the culture within our department." The officers looked at each other, some nodding, others deep in thought. The conversation continued, but it was clear that things had shifted. The issue wasn't just about his personal experience anymore. It was about something much bigger. As the meeting ended, the man left the room with a sense of purpose. He knew that it wouldn't be easy to change the culture of the department, but it had to start somewhere. And it had to start now. He couldn't let what had happened to him be just another story in the long history of police brutality and systemic failure. He had to make sure it counted for something. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity. The man couldn't shake the weight of the conversation he had started, nor the words of the senior officer who had acknowledged the department's failures. It had been a step in the right direction, but he knew it wasn't enough. The system needed to be overhauled, and he couldn't do it alone. As much as he had hoped for change, he understood the hard truth. Talking about change wasn't enough. Real change took time, and it took people willing to challenge the status quo. He had seen the way some officers clung to their biases, convinced that their worldview was the right one. He had also seen the fear that came with confronting those biases, fear of losing power, fear of being judged by colleagues, and fear of facing the consequences of their actions. For many, it was easier to look the other way and pretend the issues didn't exist. But he couldn't pretend, not anymore. He had seen firsthand how deeply ingrained the problem was, how it affected the way officers interacted with the community, and how it created an environment of mistrust. The man knew that the department had to take responsibility, but it wasn't just about internal policy changes or training programs. It was about a fundamental shift in the way the officers viewed themselves and their role in society. The truth was, many of them had forgotten the very reason they had joined the force in the first place: to protect and serve. Somewhere along the way, that ideal had been lost. The system had warped their perspective, turning them into people who saw civilians as threats rather than individuals deserving of respect. He began to reach out to fellow union members, to officers he knew shared his concerns. The conversations weren't easy. Many of them had their own reservations, their own fears about what would happen if they spoke out. But the man was persistent. He knew that if they didn't stand together, nothing would ever change. Slowly, the group began to grow. At first, it was just a few trusted officers, those who had worked alongside him for years and understood the challenges they faced. But as the word spread, more and more officers came forward, willing to speak up and demand change. It wasn't long before the man found himself standing before a room full of officers. He had requested a meeting with the department's leadership, and now, as he looked around, he saw the faces of people who had once stood by him, but were now hesitant, unsure of what to expect. The weight of the moment settled over him, but he remained calm. He had already made up his mind. There was no turning back. The conversation started with the usual pleasantries. The chief spoke about the department's accomplishments, the progress they had made in certain areas. But the man wasn't interested in talking about progress that hadn't been made. He wasn't interested in patting themselves on the back for minor successes, while ignoring the larger issues that were festering beneath the surface. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice clear and firm. "I've been a part of this department for a long time," he began. "I've worked alongside many of you, and I've seen the good work we can do. But I've also seen the failures. I've seen how bias and prejudice have influenced the way we treat people, how we've allowed ourselves to become disconnected from the very community we swore to protect." There was a shift in the room, a quiet tension as the officers listened. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others crossed their arms. The man could feel their resistance, but he didn't back down. This was bigger than personal discomfort. This was about the future of the department. "We've allowed ourselves to ignore the warning signs," he continued. "We've become complacent, believing that the problems we face are just part of the job. But they're not. They never were. And we can't keep pretending that things are fine when they're not. People are afraid of us, and they have every right to be." The silence in the room was palpable now. He could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. It wasn't an easy conversation to have, but it was a necessary one. He could see the resistance in their eyes, but he also saw the flickers of realization. They knew deep down that he was right. "We need to change," he said, his voice steady. "We need to change how we see ourselves and how we see the people we're supposed to protect. We need to hold each other accountable, and we need to do it now." The room remained quiet, but the tension had shifted. Some officers were nodding while others were deep in thought. It was clear that the conversation wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. There would be no easy solutions, no quick fixes. This was going to take time, and it was going to take work. But the man was ready. He knew that change was never easy, but it was necessary. The chief finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. "I hear what you're saying," he said. "And I know that we've had our share of problems. But this department has a long history, and changing the culture won't be easy. It will take time, and it will take cooperation from all of us." The man nodded. He knew the chief was right. But he also knew that time was something they didn't have. Every day that passed without action was another day that the system remained broken. He wasn't willing to wait any longer. "We can't keep waiting for change to come from the top down," he said. "It has to come from within. It has to come from all of us, from every officer, every leader, every person in this department. We have to be willing to look at ourselves and ask the hard questions. Are we doing enough? Are we truly serving the community, or are we just maintaining the status quo? There was a long pause as the room absorbed his words. Some officers were still skeptical, but others were beginning to see the truth in what he was saying. The man knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined to stay the course. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Over the next few weeks, the man continued to push for change. He worked closely with the officers who had rallied around him, organizing discussions, training sessions, and meetings with community leaders. It was slow, painstaking work, but it was beginning to make a difference. The conversations were happening. The walls were starting to come down bit by bit. But it wasn't just the officers who needed to change. The community had to be a part of the conversation too. The man reached out to local organizations, to residents who had long been wary of the police, to listen to their concerns and hear their stories. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when he felt like he was fighting an uphill battle, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Not after everything that had happened. The man had always believed in the power of dialogue, in the ability of people to come together and find common ground. But he had also come to realize that change wasn't just about talking. It was about taking action, about being willing to make difficult decisions and confront uncomfortable truths. And as he stood at the forefront of the fight for justice, he knew that the work had only just begun. The road ahead was long, but he was ready for it. He had no choice but to be. The tension that had built up in the department after the meeting began to shift. The man could feel it. Something was changing, but it was subtle. It was as if a door had been cracked open, and though they weren't rushing through it, at least some officers were willing to peer inside. He couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. But that feeling was tempered with a healthy dose of realism. Change, he knew, wasn't going to happen overnight. Even with all the discussions and the growing support for reform, it would take time for the department to fully embrace what he was pushing for. But for the first time, he felt as if there was a possibility, no matter how small, that real progress could be made. The weeks following the meeting had been filled with late-night discussions, more internal meetings, and a series of workshops designed to address the cultural and systemic issues that had plagued the department for years. But despite all the progress on paper, there was still a long way to go. The man knew that. The officers who were truly committed to change were few, but they were determined. It was the others, the ones who were resistant, who believed things were fine the way they were, that worried him. They were the ones who could slow the process down, the ones who could undermine the efforts before they even gained momentum, and he couldn't let that happen. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, a call came through. It was from the chief. The man hadn't spoken to him in a few days, and while he had expected the usual updates on departmental matters, this call was different. The chief's voice sounded strained, as though he was struggling to find the right words. "We need to talk," the chief said, his tone serious. "There's been an incident." The man's heart sank. He had been bracing himself for this moment, knowing that it was inevitable. The road to reform would never be smooth, and there would always be setbacks. But he hadn't expected this. "What happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's one of our own," the chief replied. "An officer was involved in an altercation. It escalated quickly, and now we're facing a public outcry." The man felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly what this meant. This was the kind of situation that could undo everything they had worked for. One bad decision, one violent outburst, and all the progress they had made would be forgotten. The community would turn against them. The officers who were trying to make change would be discredited, and the resistance within the department would gain more power. "Where is the officer now?" the man asked. "Suspended pending an investigation," the chief answered. "But the damage has been done. The media is already all over it." The man sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was a test, a crucial one. How the department responded in the coming days would determine whether the efforts to bring about change were going to succeed or fail. He couldn't afford to let this slip through their fingers. "We need to act quickly," the man said, his voice firm. "We need to make it clear that this behavior will not be tolerated, and we need to ensure the community knows we're taking responsibility." The chief agreed, but the man could hear the hesitation in his voice. He understood the complexity of the situation. The officer involved in the incident wasn't just a rookie. They were someone who had been with the department for years. They were well liked by some of their colleagues, and their actions would be hard to reconcile with the department's goals of reform. But the man knew one thing for sure. They couldn't make excuses. Not this time. The department had to take a stand no matter the cost. Over the next few days, the media frenzy grew. News outlets were filled with stories about the altercation, with interviews from community members who were furious at the department's failure to address misconduct. The pressure mounted, and the department was forced to make a public statement. The man knew the statement had to be strong, decisive, and, most importantly, genuine. He had seen enough empty promises to last a lifetime, and he wasn't willing to be a part of one more. On the morning of the press conference, he stood in front of the cameras, flanked by the chief and other senior officers. The weight of the moment was heavy, and the eyes of the entire department and the public were on them. He could feel the tension in the air, the skepticism, the doubts. They had already been given a chance to prove themselves, and now they had to show that they were truly committed to change. "We are here today to address the actions of one of our officers," the man began, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "What happened was unacceptable. It goes against everything we stand for, and it will not be tolerated. This department has a responsibility to the people we serve, and we have failed to live up to that responsibility, but we are committed to making it right. We will hold this officer accountable, and we will continue to work tirelessly to ensure that incidents like this never happen again." There was a pause as the reporters absorbed his words. The man could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he didn't back down. He knew this was only the first step and there was still much work to be done. But he also knew that if they didn't address this head-on, the department would lose the trust of the very community they were meant to protect. After the press conference, the department launched an internal investigation. The man kept a close eye on the process, ensuring that the investigation was thorough and transparent. He knew that transparency was key. The community had to see that the department was serious about reform, that they weren't just making empty promises. As the investigation unfolded, the officer involved in the incident was interviewed, and the evidence was carefully examined. It became clear that the officer had acted in a way that was not only excessive, but also inconsistent with the values the department was trying to instill. The officer's actions were a reflection of the very problems the man had been fighting against for years: the sense of entitlement, the lack of accountability, and the disregard for the safety and dignity of others. The decision was made to terminate the officer's employment. It was a difficult decision, but it was necessary. The department could not afford to allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked, no matter how difficult it was to part ways with a long-serving member. When the news broke, the community responded. There were mixed reactions. Some applauded the department for taking swift action, while others remained skeptical, unsure if this was just another attempt to cover up deeper issues. But for the man, it was a step in the right direction. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was all you needed. In the weeks that followed, the department began to implement more substantial reforms. They introduced new training programs focused on de-escalation, community engagement, and cultural sensitivity. They created a new task force to address internal misconduct and ensure that officers were held accountable for their actions. The man worked tirelessly, meeting with officers, community leaders, and activists to ensure that the department's efforts were not just superficial, but meaningful. The road to reform was long and difficult, but the man knew that they couldn't stop now. He had seen how one moment of recklessness could undo years of work, but he had also seen how a commitment to change, no matter how small, could create a ripple effect that reached far beyond the department's walls. It wasn't easy. It never would be. But the man was ready. He had no choice but to be. The work wasn't over, not by a long shot. Despite the steps they had taken, despite the promises made and the reforms initiated, the man knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Change was never a smooth, linear process, and as much as he wanted to believe they were on the right path, he knew that true reform would take years, if not decades, to fully take root. The cracks that had formed within the department were deep, and it wasn't going to be easy to mend them. The media had moved on from the officer's incident, but the eyes of the public were still fixed on the department. It wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. It was about the culture, the system, and the way the entire department functioned. The man had heard the skepticism from community leaders, from fellow officers, and even from his closest allies. They were all waiting to see if the department would actually follow through. Would the changes stick or would they be abandoned the moment things got tough? But this time the man was determined not to let it slip away. He knew that the department's reputation was at stake, but more than that, the safety and trust of the community were too important to be left to chance. Every conversation, every decision, every action would count. He couldn't afford to make a misstep. One morning, after several weeks of pushing forward with reforms, the man received a call that he wasn't expecting. It was from one of the local community leaders, a woman who had been critical of the police department for years. She had always been vocal about the lack of trust between the community and the officers who patrolled their neighborhoods. Her criticism had been harsh but fair. She had seen the damage done by years of police violence and misconduct, and she wasn't willing to sugarcoat things. But today her tone was different. "Are you available to meet?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. "I think we need to talk." The man felt a jolt of anxiety. He had no idea what to expect from the conversation, but he knew it was important. This wasn't just about having a discussion. It was about finding out where the community stood now that the department had taken steps to reform. Were they willing to give the department a chance, or had the damage already been done? "I'm free this afternoon," he said, trying to steady his voice. "I'll come to your office." They arranged a time, and by the afternoon he was sitting across from her in a small, modest office. She was a woman of few words, but her eyes carried the weight of experience. Years of watching communities be ignored. Years of witnessing the deep pain caused by a broken system. As he sat down, he could sense the tension in the room. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation, and he wasn't sure how it would end. "I've been watching you," she said after a long pause. "Watching how you've handled things, how you've tried to bring about change. And I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure if I could trust you." The man nodded, understanding her skepticism. He had been in her shoes before. He had seen officers come and go, all claiming they wanted to make things better. But those promises were always empty. Words without actions. He couldn't blame her for doubting him, for doubting the department. "But something's different now," she continued. "You've put yourself out there. You've been consistent. You haven't backed down, and I respect that." A small but genuine sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The community was watching, and while trust wouldn't be built overnight, moments like this, small victories, were crucial. "But I need to know something," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Do you truly understand the pain? Do you understand the anger that people in my community feel when they see police officers on the street? Because frankly, that's the only way you're going to be able to fix this. It's not just about policies. It's about making people feel safe in their own neighborhoods again." He sat there for a moment, absorbing her words. He had spent his career working within the department, advocating for fairness, holding officers accountable, and pushing for reform. But he realized in that moment that he hadn't fully understood the depth of the mistrust. He hadn't fully grasped the emotional toll that the community had endured over the years. It wasn't just about crime rates or police tactics. It was about years of fear, frustration, and a constant sense of being overlooked. "I get it," he said softly, his voice tinged with sincerity. "I won't pretend to understand everything you've been through, but I am listening. I hear you, and I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. It's not just about fixing the department. It's about healing the relationship between us and the people we're meant to protect." The woman looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. He could feel her evaluating him, deciding if his words were enough to earn her trust. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I'll give you a chance," she said, "but you have to keep pushing. You can't stop now. There's still so much work to be done." The man left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone, the community, the officers, the department as a whole. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that it was the only road worth traveling. He had been given a chance, not just to reform the department, but to rebuild the trust that had been broken for far too long. Over the next few months, the man continued to work tirelessly. He met with more community leaders, held public forums, and made himself available to anyone who had concerns. But he also pushed his fellow officers harder than ever before. He demanded accountability, not just for the officers who had been involved in misconduct, but for everyone. If they were truly going to change, every single officer had to be on board. It wasn't easy. The resistance was still there, lurking in the background, but it was becoming weaker. Officers who had once been staunch defenders of the old ways were slowly coming around. The pressure from the public, the community, and their own colleagues was forcing them to reconsider their stance. One evening, as the man stood before a group of officers, he could see the difference in their eyes. They weren't just there because they had to be. They were there because they wanted to be. They were beginning to understand the importance of the work they were doing. They were beginning to understand that their role as officers was more than just enforcing the law. It was about serving the people.